Social Darwinism emerged as a controversial and flawed application to human societies of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. While Darwin's ideas about evolution were groundbreaking in biology, social Darwinists misused these concepts to justify existing social hierarchies and inequalities. By suggesting that the survival of the fittest extended beyond the natural world to human economics, politics, and race, social Darwinism became a powerful ideological tool for rationalizing oppression, imperialism, and eugenics. Although largely discredited today, social Darwinism left a profound impact on society, reinforcing systems of inequality and exploitation. Howdy, I'm just some random nude dude sitting in my closet talking to myself. It's also where I celebrate the power of free thinking and encourage bold ideas. As a society, we're often afraid to challenge the norms and think outside the box. But here, I embrace the unconventional. So sit back, relax, and join me on this journey of exploration where we embrace our inner nude dude and push boundaries to discover new perspectives. Social Darwinism is a socio-political ideology that emerged in the late 19th century, based on a distorted interpretation of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. While Darwin's work focused on biological evolution, explaining how species adapt and change over time through the survival of the fittest, and those were not his words, some thinkers, such as Herbert Spencer and others, extrapolated these ideas to human societies, economics, and politics. This intellectual movement, known as Social Darwinism, promoted the belief that competition and struggle between individuals, classes, and races were natural and desirable processes that mirrored the biological competition seen in nature. The rise of social Darwinism coincided with the Industrial Revolution, a period of profound economic transformation that led to vast inequalities between the wealthy elite and the working class. The massive social upheavals of the time, including urbanization, mass migration, and the growth of capitalism, created an environment in which many sought to explain and justify the stark disparities of wealth, power, and opportunity. Social Darwinism provided a convenient intellectual framework for doing so, suggesting that social hierarchies were not only natural but essential for the progress of civilization. Those who succeeded in accumulating wealth and power were seen as the fittest, while the poor and marginalized were viewed as inherently inferior or unworthy of survival in the competitive marketplace. This ideology extended beyond economics, influencing such fields as sociology, anthropology, and even statecraft. Social Darwinism was invoked to justify policies of imperialism, where European powers viewed their domination of African, Asian, and indigenous populations as a natural and inevitable result of racial superiority. It also provided the foundation for eugenics, a pseudoscientific movement that aimed to control human reproduction to improve the gene pool by preventing those deemed unfit from having children. While the biological theory of evolution is grounded in rigorous science, social Darwinism represented a gross misapplication of these principles to justify inequality, exploitation, and oppression. Its proponents ignored the complexities of human society, factors like cooperation, compassion, and systemic structures, focusing instead on a narrow and self-serving view of competition. As a result, social Darwinism gave intellectual cover to some of the most destructive policies and ideologies of the modern era, including colonialism, racial segregation, economic laissez-faire policies, and the rise of fascist movements. In this discussion, we'll examine the core tenets of social Darwinism, identify the logical fallacies inherent in its reasoning, and explore the wide-reaching consequences it had on global history. From its justification of economic inequality to its role in fueling imperialism and eugenics, The ideology of social Darwinism had a profound and often devastating impact on the development of societies in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Understanding its influence allows us to critically assess how scientific theories can be misused to support harmful social policies and highlights the importance of ethical considerations when applying scientific ideas to human affairs. Social Darwinism is a theory that emerged in the late 19th century, heavily influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin's theory explains how, in the natural world, organisms with traits that confer advantages in survival and reproduction are more likely to pass those traits on to future generations. This process, often summarized as the survival of the fittest, a phrase coined by Herbert Spencer, not Darwin, describes the natural mechanisms by which species evolve over time. However, social Darwinism takes this biological concept and applies it to human societies. Proponents of social Darwinism argue that the inequalities seen between individuals, classes, and nations are a natural and desirable outcome of human evolution. The strong rise to the top, while the weak are left behind. And this is framed as both an inevitable and positive development. Social Darwinism arose during a time of rapid social, economic, and scientific transformation in Europe and the United States. This period saw significant advances in biology, particularly following Charles Darwin's groundbreaking publication On the Origin of Species in 1859. Darwin's work introduced the concept of natural selection, wherein organisms with traits better suited to their environments had a higher chance of surviving and reproducing, leading to evolutionary changes over time. Although Darwin's theory focused on biological evolution in the natural world, thinkers outside biology, particularly in the fields of sociology, economics, and politics, began to apply these concepts to human societies. The central idea behind social Darwinism is that just as natural selection operates in the biological world, similar processes occur within human civilization, shaping its social, political, and economic systems. Two figures are often credited with adapting Darwinian ideas to the social sphere: Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner. These thinkers provided much of the intellectual groundwork for social Darwinism, although they often interpreted Darwin's ideas in ways that departed from his original intent. Herbert Spencer was a British philosopher who became one of the foremost proponents of social Darwinism. Spencer coined the phrase survival of the fittest and applied it to human societies. He argued that social progress was the result of individuals and groups competing for limited resources, with the fittest rising to positions of power and influence. For Spencer, this competition was a natural and desirable process that led to the societal advancement by rewarding the most capable and allowing the less capable to fail. He opposed government intervention in the economy or social welfare, seeing such efforts as hindering natural societal evolution. William Graham Sumner was an American sociologist and economist who also championed social Darwinist ideas. Sumner believed that wealth and success were indicators of biological and moral superiority. He argued that attempts to help the poor or disadvantaged through government intervention would only disrupt the natural social order. Sumner's views contributed to the justification of laissez-faire capitalism, where unregulated competition was seen as the engine of progress. While Darwin's work focused on the biological world, Spencer and Sumner extended his theories to justify the social and economic status quo, arguing that existing hierarchies were not only natural, but also inevitable and beneficial. Social Darwinism emerged during a period marked by vast changes in both Western economies and global geopolitics. The Industrial Revolution had led to the rise of powerful capitalist economies, especially in Britain, the United States, and parts of Europe. With rapid technological advances came vast inequalities in wealth, particularly between industrialists who amassed significant fortunes and laborers who often toiled in harsh conditions for minimal pay. Sounds like today. At the same time, Western powers were expanding their empires through colonization and imperialism. The late 19th century was a high point of European colonial expansion in Africa and Asia. Many imperialists used social Darwinist arguments to justify the subjugation of non-European peoples, that is, non-white people. They claimed that the superiority of European technology, military power, and social organization was evidence of their biological superiority. Thus, the conquest and domination of weaker nations were framed as a natural and even benevolent process, spreading civilization to less developed societies. In this context, social Darwinism provided a convenient ideological tool for those who wished to rationalize both domestic inequalities between rich and poor and international inequalities between colonizers and the colonized. By invoking the idea of natural selection, proponents could argue that social hierarchies were not merely the result of historical contingencies or unjust systems, but the inevitable outcome of evolutionary processes. It's important to note that Charles Darwin himself never applied his theory of natural selection to human society in the way that social Darwinists did. In fact, Darwin was skeptical about using his biological ideas to explain complex social phenomena, and he showed concern about the potential misuse of his theories. Darwin's theory was grounded in the observation of biological species in nature, focusing on gradual changes over vast timescales through processes like mutation, variation, and adaptation to environmental pressures. These changes are not inherently moral. They simply describe how species evolve over time. Social Darwinism, on the other hand, attempts to apply these principles to human social dynamics, which are far more influenced by culture, politics, and individual choices. This is a fundamental misapplication of biological concepts. While social Darwinism emphasizes competition and struggle, Darwin himself recognized the role of cooperation in evolution. In his later work, The Descent of Man in 1871, Darwin wrote about how human survival often depended on mutual aid, empathy, and social bonds. Cooperation, not just competition, was crucial for the success of many species, especially humans. This aspect of Darwin's theory was largely ignored by social Darwinists, who preferred to focus on competitive struggle as the driving force of social progress. Darwin was aware of the ethical implications of his work and was careful not to draw direct moral conclusions from his scientific findings. In contrast, social Darwinists made explicit moral claims based on their distorted interpretation of natural selection. They argued that those who succeeded in society were biologically superior and therefore deserved their success, while those who failed were inherently inferior. This led to a dangerous conflagration of biology with morality, where success and power were seen as indicators of virtue, and poverty and weakness were viewed as signs of moral and biological failure. Social Darwinism's appeal lay in its ability to provide a seemingly scientific justification for existing social hierarchies and power structures. It resonated with powerful industrialists, colonial rulers, and those who benefited from unregulated capitalism, because it suggested that their privileged positions were not the result of exploitation, luck, or historical accident, when of course they were, but of inherent superiority. For those in positions of power, social Darwinism validated their wealth and dominance as the outcome of natural laws. Conversely, it delegitimized attempts to create a more just or equal society. Efforts to reduce inequality through social reforms, labor rights, or redistribution were seen as interfering with the natural order, perpetuating the survival of the unfit at the expense of social progress. This ideological framework was especially useful for resisting political movements that sought to challenge the status quo. Labor unions, socialist movements, and advocates for public education or welfare programs were often dismissed as naive or dangerous by social Darwinists, who argued that such policies could lead to social decay by protecting those who were unfit for the competitive struggle of life. Social Darwinism took Darwin's scientific theory of natural selection and misapplied it to human society, creating an ideological framework that justified social inequality, imperialism, and laissez-faire capitalism. It diverged significantly from Darwin's own ideas, particularly by ignoring the role of cooperation in human evolution and by making moral claims about the superiority of certain groups or individuals. The theory thrived in the historical context marked by industrial capitalism and imperial expansion, providing a convenient rationale for those in power to resist social reforms and maintain existing hierarchies. Social Darwinism rests on several key principles, all of which are derived from a misapplication of Darwinian evolutionary theory to human societies. These tenets helped shape economic, political, and social ideologies during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often with destructive results. At its core, social Darwinism is built on the idea that competition, hierarchy, and inequality are natural, inevitable, and even desirable aspects of human society. The phrase survival of the fittest is one of the most well-known concepts associated with social Darwinism, although it was not coined by Charles Darwin, but by philosopher Herbert Spencer. In biological terms, fitness refers to an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in a given environment. Social Darwinists, however, broaden the concept of fitness to refer to success in human society, particularly in terms of wealth, power, and social status. Like they're all different? It's all one thing, right? In this framework, fitness is equated with economic success and social dominance. Those who can rise to the top of the social and economic hierarchy are seen as more fit in the biological sense, while those who struggle or fail are viewed as weak or inherently inferior. According to this logic, the social and economic elite are naturally superior, and their success is evidence of their biological advantages. In contrast, poverty and failure are interpreted as signs of inherent weakness or lack of ability, and thus the disadvantaged are seen as less worthy of support. This idea extends beyond individuals to encompass social groups, races, and nations. Social Darwinists believed that certain racial or national groups were biologically superior and destined to dominate others. This belief underpinned many justifications for colonialism and imperialism, where the conquest and subjugation of weaker races were framed as a part of natural evolutionary process. However, this concept is deeply flawed when applied to human societies. It overlooks the complex social, economic, and political factors that contribute to individual and group success. Furthermore, it ignores the reality that societal progress often stems from cooperation, not competition, and that measures of human success are not purely determined by biology. The idea that social hierarchies are based on inherent biological fitness also reinforces harmful stereotypes, perpetuating racial and class discrimination. One of the most significant implications of social Darwinism is its alignment with laissez-faire capitalism, a philosophy that advocates minimal government intervention in the economy. Social Darwinists believed that economic competition was a natural and beneficial force that would lead to societal progress by ensuring that only the most capable individuals and businesses survived and thrived. That's why we bail them all out when they fail now, right? In this sense, Free market competition was likened to the process of natural selection, where the strong prosper and the weak fail. Unless the weak are powerful, then they need to prosper too, even if they fail. From this perspective, any form of government intervention, such as regulations, labor protections, or welfare programs, was viewed as unnatural interference in the evolutionary process. Proponents of social Darwinism argued that such interventions would disrupt the natural order, allowing the unfit to survive and perpetuate their weakness. The belief was that competition, left unchecked, would drive innovation, efficiency, and progress, while government efforts to protect the vulnerable would undermine these processes. In practice, this meant opposition to reforms that sought to address the societal and economic inequalities generated by the Industrial Revolution. Social Darwinists opposed laws that regulated working conditions, such as child labor laws or safety standards, and argued that these reforms interfered with the free market and the natural competition between workers. They also opposed progressive taxation and wealth redistribution, viewing them as forms of artificial leveling that punished the successful and rewarded the unfit. However, the laissez-faire interpretation of social Darwinism ignores the ethical and moral dimensions of human society. It assumes that unchecked competition is inherently beneficial, but in reality, unregulated markets often lead to exploitation, poverty, and vast disparities in wealth and power. By focusing solely on competition, social Darwinism overlooks the role that cooperation, community support, and social justice play in creating a fair and prosperous society. Moreover, laissez-faire economics can entrench existing inequalities, preventing upward mobility and reinforcing social hierarchies. It also ignores that industrialists didn't actually do the work themselves, but are standing on the backs of all the workers that worked for them actually producing the materials. A central premise of social Darwinism is biological determinism, the idea that human behavior, social status, and economic success are determined primarily by genetic or biological factors. According to this view, individuals are born with certain inherent abilities or characteristics that make them more or less likely to succeed in society. Those who are wealthy, powerful, or influential are seen as possessing superior traits, while those who are poor, marginalized, or unsuccessful are viewed as biologically inferior. This belief in the innate superiority of certain individuals, classes, or races provided a convenient justification for existing social hierarchies and inequalities. Social Darwinists argued that social or economic disparities are not the result of unjust systems or unequal opportunities, but rather the natural outcome of biological differences. In this way, the wealthy elite could justify their privileges by claiming it was the reflection of their inherent superiority, while dismissing the struggles of the poor as the inevitable result of their inherent inferiority. Biological determinism also reinforced racial and ethnic hierarchies, as social Darwinists applied these ideas not only to individuals, but to entire groups of people. This led to the belief that certain races or ethnicities were naturally more intelligent, industrious, and capable than others, and that these inherent differences justified the domination of superior races over inferior ones. This thinking played a major role in justifying European colonialism, as well as the social exclusion and marginalization of racial minorities within industrialized nations. However, biological determinism is a gross oversimplification of the complex factors that shape human behavior and social outcomes. Modern science has shown that genetics play only a limited role in determining social success. Factors such as environment, education, culture, and social structures are far more influential in shaping individuals' opportunities and outcomes. Moreover, the belief in biological determinism ignores the reality that human beings are not solely defined by their biology. We are also shaped by our experiences, choices, and the societies in which we live. Another key tenet of social Darwinism is its opposition to social welfare programs, which are viewed as artificial interventions that disrupt the natural process of competition. Social Darwinists argued that by providing support for the poor, sick, or otherwise disadvantaged, society was preventing the unfit from being naturally selected out. In this view, welfare programs, charity, and other forms of assistance were seen as counterproductive because they allowed individuals who were not fit to survive in a competitive environment of society. This opposition to welfare was particularly influential during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when governments in industrialized nations began to grapple with social consequences of rapid industrialization. As urbanization and mechanization led to widespread poverty, poor working conditions, and economic inequality, there were growing calls for government intervention to improve living standards. Social Darwinists, however, opposed these reforms, arguing that they would interfere with the natural order by enabling the survival of individuals who could not compete effectively. The implications of this belief were far-reaching. It justified a lack of empathy or support for the most vulnerable members of society, framing their suffering as a necessary part of the evolutionary process. It also fueled opposition to labor movements and efforts to improve working conditions, as social Darwinists argued that workers who could not compete in the market without protection or assistance were naturally less fit and should not be supported. In reality, human societies are built on compassion, solidarity, and mutual aid, values that social Darwinism overlooks. Social welfare programs are not just about undermining competition, but about ensuring that all individuals have the opportunity to lead dignified lives and contribute to society. In fact, providing education, health care, and social safety nets often helps individuals improve their circumstances, thereby fostering greater societal progress and stability. By rejecting the value of social welfare, social Darwinism promotes a harsh and inequitable version of society that leaves the most vulnerable without support or recourse. One of the most pernicious aspects of social Darwinism is its application to races and nations, which led to the belief in the inherent superiority of certain racial or national groups over others. This aspect of social Darwinism provided a powerful justification for imperialism, colonialism, and racism during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Social Darwinists argued that just as individuals compete for survival, so too do races and nations, with the strongest and most civilized naturally rising to dominate others. In this context, European imperial powers framed their colonial conquests as part of a natural evolutionary process. The domination of non-European peoples was viewed as inevitable, as European nations were seen as biologically superior and destined to expand their influence. Social Darwinism also supported the idea of a civilizing mission, where European colonizers believed it was their duty to bring their supposedly superior civilization, culture, and values to the inferior peoples they ruled. This belief in racial and national superiority not only justified the exploitation and oppression of colonized peoples, but also led to the belief that they were unfit to govern themselves. Social Darwinists claimed that non-European races lacked the intelligence, discipline, or moral character necessary for self-rule, thereby reinforcing the political and economic dominance of imperial powers. However, modern anthropology, genetics, and sociology have thoroughly debunked the idea of racial superiority. Human beings are far more similar than different, and racial or national distinctions have little to do with biological fitness or inherent ability. The legacy of social Darwinism's racial hierarchies continues to influence racism and nationalism today. But these ideas are based on flawed and outdated assumptions about human diversity. While social Darwinism may appear grounded in scientific principles at first glance, it rests on several logical fallacies. These fallacies reveal the underlying flaws in the reasoning behind the theory and explain why its conclusions are both scientifically and ethically dubious. Social Darwinism is not only morally problematic, it is also riddled with logical fallacies that undermine its intellectual foundation. By misinterpreting Darwin's theories of natural selection and applying them inappropriately to human society, social Darwinism makes several critical errors in reasoning. These fallacies include the naturalistic fallacy, the fallacy of equivocation, the appeal to nature, overgeneralization, and confirmation bias, among others. One of the core logical errors of social Darwinism is the naturalistic fallacy, the mistaken belief that just because something occurs in nature, it's morally right or should be emulated in human society. Social Darwinists argue that because competition and survival of the fittest are natural in the animal kingdom, they should also guide human social, political, and economic systems. This reasoning conflates what is with what ought to be, assuming that the way nature functions provides a moral guide for human behavior. In biological evolution, natural selection is a process without intent or moral judgment. It simply describes how traits that increase reproductive success tend to be passed on to future generations. However, in human societies, moral, ethical, and social values shape our decisions. While competition exists in nature, humans have developed compassion, cooperation, justice, and altruism as part of our social evolution. By arguing that the cutthroat competition seen in nature should guide human affairs, social Darwinists ignore these unique human traits, which are essential for maintaining stable, fair, and thriving societies. Moreover, many behaviors observed in nature, such as violence, predation, and the abandonment of the weak, are not morally acceptable in human societies. The naturalistic fallacy fails to recognize that human morality is not directed by forces of nature, but is instead shaped by cultural, philosophical, and ethical considerations that aim to promote the well-being of individuals and communities. Another significant logical error in social Darwinism is the fallacy of equivocation, the misleading use of a word or concept in multiple senses within the same argument. In this case, the term fitness is used ambiguously to refer to both biological fitness in the Darwinian sense and success or superiority in the social or economic sense. In Darwinian evolution, fitness refers to the organism's ability to survive and reproduce in a specific environment, which is largely determined by its physical and behavioral traits. However, social Darwinists equate fitness with social success, such as wealth, power, or influence, implying that those who achieve economic success are biologically superior. This shift in meaning distorts the original concept of fitness and misapplies it to a completely different context. Biological fitness is context-dependent. An organism may be well suited to one environment, but poorly adapted to another. In contrast, social Darwinism treats fitness as an absolute measure of superiority, suggesting that those who succeed in any social system are inherently better than those who do not. This ignores the fact that social success is often determined by external factors, such as privilege, opportunity, access to resources, and social networks, rather than inherent biological traits. Closely related to the naturalistic fallacy, social Darwinism also relies on the appeal to nature, the argument that something is good or desirable simply because it is natural. Social Darwinists claim that since competition and the struggle for survival are natural processes in the animal kingdom, they should be embraced and celebrated in human society. They argue that social and economic inequalities are the natural outcomes of these processes, and that any attempt to mitigate them through government intervention or social welfare is unnatural and harmful. The appeal to nature fallacy fails to recognize that not everything that is natural is beneficial or morally acceptable. Just because a process occurs in nature does not mean it should be adopted as a guiding principle for human society. For example, diseases, natural disasters, and predation are all natural. But humans actively work to prevent and mitigate their effects because they are harmful to our well-being. In the same sense, unregulated competition and inequality may be natural in a certain sense, but that does not mean they are desirable or conducive to a fair and just society. Moreover, human societies are unique in that they are not bound by the same rules that govern the natural world. Unlike animals, humans have the capacity for rational thought, ethical reasoning, and collective decision-making, which allow us to build systems that prioritize equality, justice, and mutual aid over competition and dominance. Social Darwinism also commits the fallacy of overgeneralization, the assumption that what is true in one context must be true in all contexts. Social Darwinists take the principle of natural selection, which apply to biological evolution, and extend them to human social and economic systems without considering the vast differences between these contexts. In nature, natural selection operates over long periods of time and is driven by factors like genetic variation, environmental pressures, and reproductive success. In human societies, success and failure are influenced by a wide range of social, political, and economic factors, including access to education, social mobility, inherited wealth, and discrimination. Social Darwinists overlook these complexities and falsely assume that competition in the marketplace or social hierarchy is equivalent to the evolutionary struggle for survival. This overgeneralization leads to a deterministic view of human society, where those at the top are presumed to be inherently superior, and those at the bottom are seen as biologically destined to fail. In reality, human success is shaped by a complex interplay of individual effort, social structures, and historical circumstances, rather than a simple process of natural selection. Another critical flaw in social Darwinism is confirmation bias, the tendency to favor information that supports pre-existing beliefs while ignoring or dismissing evidence that contradicts them. Proponents of social Darwinism often point to examples of wealthy, powerful individuals or nations as evidence of the survival of the fittest, while ignoring the structural inequalities, historical contingencies, and social advantages that contribute to their success. For example, social Darwinists might argue that the wealth and power of industrialists like Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller were proof of their biological superiority, while overlooking the fact that these individuals benefited from monopolistic practices, labor exploitation, and favorable political conditions. Similarly, they might cite the dominance of European nations during the age of imperialism as evidence of racial superiority, while ignoring the role of military force, technological advances, underhandedness and deceit by European nations, and colonial exploitation in securing that dominance. By focusing only on examples that seem to confirm their worldview, social Darwinists create a distorted and overly simplistic view of human society. They fail to consider the many cases in which individuals or groups succeed not because of inherent superiority, but because of social, economic, or historical factors that have little to do with biological fitness. Social Darwinism often relies on a false dichotomy, presenting a binary choice between competition and cooperation, or between survival of the fittest and social welfare. Social Darwinists argue that society must either embrace the principles of natural selection and competition, or risk stagnation and decline by adopting policies that protect the weak and unfit. This framing creates a false choice, ignoring the fact that human societies can, and often do, balance competition with cooperation. While competition can drive innovation and progress, cooperation is equally important for building cohesive communities, ensuring fairness, and addressing social inequalities. Many of the most successful human endeavors, from scientific research to public health initiatives, are based on collaboration rather than competition. Moreover, false dichotomy ignores the fact that social welfare programs are not about undermining competition, but about creating a more level playing field where everyone has an opportunity to succeed. By providing education, healthcare, and support for the disadvantaged, society can empower individuals to reach their full potential, thereby fostering greater overall progress. Finally, social Darwinism falls victim to the is-ought problem, a philosophical issue first articulated by David Hume. The is-ought problem refers to the difficulty of deriving prescriptive moral claims, what ought to be, from descriptive statements of fact, what is. Social Darwinism attempts to move from a description of how evolution works in nature to a prescriptive argument about how human society should function. However, just because natural selection describes the way species evolve does not mean that human societies should be organized around the same principles. Evolution is a value-neutral process, while human societies are built on ethical and moral principles that aim to promote well-being, justice, and fairness. By conflating the two, social Darwinism makes the mistake of assuming that what occurs in nature provides a blueprint for human social organization. Social Darwinism has been used historically to justify a wide range of harmful policies and ideologies. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it provided a pseudoscientific justification for colonialism, imperialism, and the subjugation of non-European peoples. The belief in the biological superiority of certain races or nations underpinned brutal practices such as forced labor, resource exploitation, and cultural suppression. Social Darwinism also played a role in the development of eugenics, a movement aimed at improving the genetic quality of the human population by promoting the reproduction of desirable traits, like white skin, and limiting the reproduction of undesirable traits, like not white skin. Eugenics policies included forced sterilizations and restrictions on immigration based on race or ethnicity, leading to severe human rights abuses. Additionally, social Darwinism was invoked by some to oppose social welfare programs, arguing that helping the poor and disadvantaged would interfere with the natural process of weeding out the unfit. This ideology was particularly influential in laissez-faire capitalism, where minimal government intervention in the economy was justified on the grounds that competition would naturally lead to progress and efficiency. The consequences of social Darwinism were both profound and deeply damaging, shaping political, economic, and social policies across the world in ways that justified inequality, exploitation, and human suffering. By promoting a worldview in which competition, hierarchy, and domination were seen as natural and inevitable, social Darwinism had a direct influence on some of the darkest episodes in modern history. Its legacy can be seen in the exploitation of workers, the rise of imperialism, eugenics, racism, and the justification of economic inequality. One of the most immediate and widespread consequences of social Darwinism was its use to justify economic inequality. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrialization led to vast disparities in wealth, with a small elite amassing immense fortunes while large portions of the population lived in poverty. Social Darwinism provided a convenient intellectual framework for explaining and legitimizing these inequalities. According to social Darwinist thinking, wealth and success were the natural rewards for hard work, intelligence, and superior ability, while poverty and failure were the consequences of inherent weakness or laziness. This interpretation allowed the wealthy elite to justify their privileged position, claiming that they had earned their success through their superior fitness. In contrast, the poor were seen as unfit, biologically inferior, or incapable of competing in the modern industrial society. This ideology had practical implications for social and economic policy. Social Darwinists opposed government intervention in the economy, such as regulations, labor protections, or welfare programs, arguing that such measures would artificially prop up the unfit and disrupt the natural order. As a result, early efforts to address the social problems created by industrialization, such as child labor, unsafe working conditions, and exploitation, were often met with resistance. The laissez-faire capitalism promoted by social Darwinists helped entrench the vast inequalities, leaving millions without the support they needed to improve their lives. The view that economic inequality is a natural and inevitable result of competition persists in various forms today, influencing debates over wealth redistribution, taxation, and social welfare programs. While contemporary societies recognize the importance of addressing inequality through progressive policies, the lingering influence of social Darwinism continues to shape public attitudes towards poverty and success. Social Darwinism also played a significant role in justifying imperialism and colonialism, two of the defining features of global politics in the 19th and early 20th centuries. During this period, European powers expanded their empires across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, subjugating millions of people and exploiting their lands and resources. Social Darwinism provided a pseudoscientific rationale for these conquests, framing them as the natural extension of the evolutionary struggle between races and nations. Social Darwinists argued that just as stronger individuals succeeded in competition with weaker ones, so did stronger nations and races dominate weaker ones. European imperialists viewed their expansion as part of a civilizing mission, claiming that they were bringing progress, culture, and enlightenment to the supposedly inferior peoples of the world. This belief in racial superiority was reinforced by the notion that Europeans were biologically more advanced and therefore destined to rule over other races. The consequences of this ideology were catastrophic. Colonial powers used social Darwinism to justify the exploitation and oppression of colonized peoples, often treating them as subhuman and denying them basic rights and freedoms. In many cases, colonized populations were forced into labor, displaced from their lands, and subjected to brutal violence. Indigenous cultures were systematically destroyed, and the natural resources of colonized territories were extracted to fuel the wealth and power of the imperial nations. The belief in the natural superiority of certain races also contributed to the development of racial hierarchies within colonial societies, where European colonizers enjoyed privileged status, while indigenous peoples were relegated to the lower rungs of the social order. These hierarchies were often codified in the law, leading to systems of segregation, discrimination, and apartheid that persisted long after the formal end of colonial rule. The legacy of social Darwinism in imperialism and colonialism continues to be felt today, as many formerly colonized nations struggle with the lasting effects of economic exploitation, social inequality, and cultural erasure. The ideology also laid the groundwork for the later racial theories, including the development of eugenics and racial nationalism. One of the most direct and disturbing consequences of social Darwinism was the emergence of the eugenics movement, which sought to apply the principles of natural selection to human reproduction in order to improve the human race. Rooted in social Darwinist ideas about biological determinism and the survival of the fittest, eugenics aimed to eliminate perceived genetic weaknesses from the population by encouraging the reproduction of individuals deemed fit and discouraging or preventing those deemed unfit from having children. Eugenicists believed that traits such as intelligence, criminality, mental illness, and poverty were inherited and could be controlled through selective breeding. This led to the implementation of policies aimed at sterilizing individuals considered unfit, such as the mentally ill, the disabled, and those living in poverty. In many cases, these policies were enforced through coercion or without the consent of the individuals involved, leading to widespread human rights abuses. In the early 20th century, eugenics gained traction in countries such as the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe. In the U.S., state governments passed laws that allowed for the forced sterilization of thousands of individuals, particularly those in marginalized communities. These policies disproportionately targeted people of color, immigrants, the poor, and people with disabilities, reflecting the intersection of eugenics with racism, classism, and ableism. The eugenics movement reached its horrific apex in Nazi Germany, where it had been used to justify the Holocaust. The Nazi regime, heavily influenced by social Darwinist and eugenicist thinking, sought to purify the Aryan race by exterminating Jews, Romanian people, disabled individuals, and other groups deemed biologically inferior. This led to the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in one of the most devastating genocides in human history. The horrors of the Holocaust ultimately discredited the eugenics movement, but its legacy continues to shape debates over reproductive rights, genetic engineering, and the ethics of human enhancement technologies. The use of science to justify social inequality and discrimination remains a potent danger, reminding us of the destructive potential for social Darwinist thinking when applied to human populations. Social Darwinism significantly reinforces racism by providing a veneer of scientific legitimacy to existing racial prejudices and discriminatory practices. By framing race as a biological determinant of intelligence, morality, and social worth, social Darwinism helped to codify and institutionalize racial hierarchies that persisted for generations. In the United States, social Darwinism influenced the development of Jim Crow laws and other forms of legalized racial segregation and discrimination. Proponents of these systems argued that African Americans and other racial minorities were biologically inferior to whites and therefore naturally suited to subordinate roles in society. This belief in racial superiority was used to justify voter disenfranchisement, like it is today, segregated schools, employment discrimination, and police brutality, all of which maintain the social and economic dominance of white Americans. The ideology of social Darwinism also contributed to the rise of scientific racism, the field of pseudoscientific inquiry that sought to prove the biological superiority of certain races. This field included phrenology, the measurement of skull shapes, the classification of racial types, and the use of IQ tests to claim that certain races were inherently more intelligent than others. These scientific findings were used to justify policies that restricted immigration, denied civil rights, and perpetuated racial discrimination. In Europe, social Darwinism fueled the rise of racial nationalism and anti-Semitism, culminating in the fascist movements of the early 20th century. In Nazi Germany, racial purity and superiority were central to the regime's ideology, leading to the persecution and extermination of millions in the name of creating a biologically superior race. The reinforcement of racial hierarchies through social Darwinism had long-lasting effects on global politics and society. Even after the formal end of slavery, colonialism, and segregation, the idea of racial superiority continued to shape social attitudes, politics, and institutions. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century sought to dismantle these hierarchies, but the legacy of social Darwinism continues to influence contemporary issues of racial inequality, systemic racism, and xenophobia. Another significant consequence of social Darwinism was its opposition to social welfare programs and labor rights. By framing poverty and economic hardship as a natural consequence of individual weakness or failure, social Darwinists argued that efforts to provide support for the poor and vulnerable would interfere with the natural process of selection. This opposition to welfare took many forms. Social Darwinists were against policies such as unemployment benefits, health care programs, public housing, and Social Security, all of which were seen as enabling the survival of individuals who were unfit for the competitive marketplace. This attitude contributed to the harsh conditions faced by workers during the Industrial Revolution, as businesses prioritized profits over the well-being of their employees. Glad we don't do that today. Labor movements, which sought to improve working conditions, reduce hours, and secure fair wages, were often met with hostility from social Darwinist proponents. Workers who demanded better treatment were seen as interfering with the natural hierarchy of economic success and failure. This ideology allowed factory owners and capitalists to justify the exploitation of labor, particularly the poor, immigrants, and minorities, under the guise of economic competition and natural selection. The long-term impact of this opposition to social welfare has been significant. Even today, debates over the role of government in addressing inequality and providing social safety nets are often framed in terms of individual responsibility versus collective support. The influence of social Darwinism continues to be felt in discussions about the proper balance between free market capitalism and state intervention in the economy. Social Darwinism is based on the flawed applications of biological principles to human societies. It relies on a series of logical fallacies, including the naturalistic fallacy, the is-ought problem, and the appeal to nature, which make moral and political claims that are both scientifically dubious and ethically questionable. Human societies are not simply reflections of nature. We have the capacity for moral reasoning, empathy, and cooperation, and our progress as a species has often depended on our ability to transcend the brutality of natural selection. The ideologies promoted by social Darwinism ignore the complexity of human societies and the fundamental rights of individuals to be treated with dignity and fairness regardless of their perceived fitness. Ultimately, social Darwinism is not only logically unsound, but also deeply harmful in practice. It has been used to justify oppression, discrimination, and social inequalities, and its legacy serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of misapplying scientific concepts to justify ideologies of dominance and exclusion. At its core, social Darwinism is built on a series of misunderstandings and misapplications of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, resulting in numerous conceptual flaws. While Darwin's work provided a groundbreaking explanation for how species evolve in response to their environments, social Darwinism distorted these scientific principles by applying them to human societies, often without basis of evidence or ethics. These misinterpretations have several fundamental flaws, both scientifically and morally. One of the primary issues with social Darwinism is its inappropriate use of biological concepts like survival of the fittest to justify social hierarchies, economic disparities, and racial inequalities. Darwin's theory explained how species evolve over time through natural selection, where individuals with favorable traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. However, applying this process to human society oversimplifies the complexities of the social interaction and human behavior. Social Darwinists assume that economic success or failure, as well as social power, were a result of biological fitness, ignoring the role of historical, social, and political factors in shaping individuals' opportunities and outcomes. In reality, human societies are not purely governed by competition for resources. Cooperation, compassion, and collective action are just as critical to the development and survival of human communities. Social Darwinism falsely assumes that the cutthroat competition seen in nature can or should be directly replicated in human social and economic systems. This neglects the fact that human beings are capable of altruism and cooperation, qualities that are essential to the well-being of any society. Social Darwinism is also flawed in its biological determinism. The belief that individual success or failure is determined solely by inherent traits such as intelligence, strength, or race. By reducing social inequality to supposed biological differences, Social Darwinism ignores the profound influence of social structures, education, culture, and economic systems in shaping human outcomes. Factors like poverty, systemic racism, lack of access to education, and political oppression are minimized or ignored entirely under social Darwinism, as its proponents argue that social disparities are natural and inevitable. This reductionism strips away the complexity of human societies and promotes a rigid hierarchy where those at the top are seen as biologically superior and those at the bottom are viewed as deserving of their lower status. Such thinking dehumanizes individuals by ignoring their potential for growth and change, as well as the role of social and environmental factors in shaping opportunities. It also dismisses the idea that societies can and should intervene to address inequalities. From an ethical perspective, social Darwinism is fundamentally flawed because it encourages a brutal, zero-sum approach to human life. It promotes the belief that those who are economically or socially disadvantaged deserve their plight because they are less fit or capable. This worldview erodes any sense of social responsibility or moral obligation to help those in need, as it suggests that inequality is not only natural but desirable for the progress of society. In practice, this has led to the justification of exploitative practices such as poor working conditions, child labor, and the neglect of social welfare programs. Social Darwinism essentially absolves those in power of any responsibility to care for the vulnerable, fostering a society where empathy, cooperation, and shared responsibility are seen as weakness rather than virtues. By promoting a vision of society that rewards the strong and punishes the weak, social Darwinism runs counter to the ethical principles that underpin modern concepts of justice and equality, and violate the tenets of most major religions. While social Darwinism presents itself as being grounded in scientific principles, it fundamentally misunderstands and misrepresents the science behind natural selection. Darwin himself did not advocate for the application of his theory to human social structures, and many of the key ideas of social Darwinism were developed by thinkers such as Herbert Spencer, who coined the phrase survival of the fittest, rather than by Darwin himself. Spencer and other social Darwinists twisted evolutionary biology to fit their pre-existing beliefs about society, using selective interpretations of Darwin's work to support political and social agendas. Moreover, modern evolutionary biology recognizes that human evolution is influenced not just by individual competition, but also by cooperation, group dynamics, and environmental factors. The idea that natural selection inherently favors individual competition over all other forms of interaction is an oversimplification of the evolutionary process. This misrepresentation undermines the scientific validity of social Darwinism and demonstrates how easily scientific concepts can be distorted to serve ideological purposes. Social Darwinism also fails to account for the fact that human beings are not static entities. We have the ability to learn, grow, and change. By suggesting that people's social or economic status is the result of fixed, inherent traits, Social Darwinism denies the possibility of personal development and social progress through education, reform, and collective action. It locks individuals into rigid categories of fit and unfit based on their current circumstances, ignoring the role of opportunity, resilience, and societal investment in fostering human potential. This worldview prevents meaningful efforts to improve the conditions of marginalized groups and solve systemic problems like poverty, inequality, and discrimination. Instead, it perpetuates a sense of fatalism, where social mobility is seen as impossible, and social reform an unnatural interference in the natural order of things. The dangerous consequences of social Darwinism's flawed reasoning are clear throughout history. By legitimizing inequality, exploitation, and the dehumanization of others, it fueled some of the most harmful ideologies and movements of the modern era, including imperialism, racism, and the eugenics movement. The belief that certain races or social groups were biologically superior led to atrocities such as forced sterilization, racial segregation, and even genocide. The misuse of evolutionary theory to promote ideologies of racial superiority and economic exploitation serve as a cautionary example of how scientific ideas can be twisted to justify inhumane policies. It reminds us of the importance of grounding social policy in ethical principles that value human dignity, equality, and cooperation, rather than simplistic and dangerous interpretations of biology. The legacy of social Darwinism is a stark reminder of how the misapplication of scientific theories can have profoundly harmful consequences for society. By taking Darwin's theories of natural selection, a framework intended to explain biological evolution, and applying it to human social structures, social Darwinists help justify the most damaging ideologies and policies of modern history. From economic inequality and exploitation to imperialism, racism, and the eugenics movement, social Darwinism became a tool for rationalizing and perpetuating systems of oppression, inequality, and violence. At the heart of social Darwinism was the fallacious belief that competition, survival of the fittest, and the inherent superiority of certain individuals, classes, or races were natural laws governing human society. By equating social success with biological fitness, social Darwinists ignored the complexity and interconnectedness of human communities. The ideology dismissed the roles of cooperation, compassion, and shared responsibility, qualities that are central to the functioning of societies, as irrelevant or even detrimental to progress. This narrow and reductionist view of human potential led to devastating policies that dehumanized millions of people and left a long-lasting stain on global history. In the economic realm, social Darwinism provided intellectual cover for laissez-faire capitalism and the vast inequalities it produced. It allowed industrialists and the wealthy elite to justify their privilege as a reflection of their inherent superiority, while condemning the poor and marginalized as biologically inferior. As a result, early labor movements and social welfare programs were often resisted or dismissed, prolonging the suffering of those who were most vulnerable to the harsh conditions of industrialization. In the political and racial arenas, social Darwinism fed into the imperialist and colonial mindset, which viewed non-European races as inherently weaker and thus justified their subjugation. This pseudoscientific rationale for European dominance allowed colonial powers to strip indigenous peoples of their lands, cultures, and rights under the guise of civilizing them. Similarly, it laid the groundwork for a eugenics movement, which sought to purify and improve the human race through selective breeding, culminating in the horrific crimes of the Holocaust. While social Darwinism has been largely discredited, its underlying ideas continue to reverberate through modern societies. Contemporary debates over economic inequality, immigration, and even healthcare sometimes echo the social Darwinist assumption that some groups are naturally more deserving of success and survival than others. The remnants of this ideology can be seen in the persistence of systemic racism, the demonization of the poor, and the justification of extreme wealth disparities as a natural outcome of competition. This troubling legacy teaches us an important lesson about the ethical implications of applying scientific ideas to social and political life. Scientific theories, when removed from their proper context and stripped of nuance, can become dangerous tools in the hands of those seeking to preserve power or justify exploitation. It's crucial that we approach the application of scientific knowledge with humility and a deep sense of social responsibility, ensuring that our use of such ideas promotes equality, justice, and the well-being of all people. Moreover, this cautionary tale underscores the need to resist ideologies that reduce human beings to mere instruments of competition or economic output. Human societies thrive not just through competition, but also through cooperation, empathy, and mutual support. By recognizing the value of these qualities, we can build a more just and equitable world that rejects the false hierarchies and divisive thinking propagated by social Darwinism. Social Darwinism stands as a powerful example of how the misuse of science can lead to profound social and moral failures. Its consequences, seen in imperialism, racism, economic inequality, and eugenics, serves as a warning against simplistic interpretations of complex theories and remind us that ethical responsibility comes from scientific inquiry. As we continue to grapple with the new advances in genetics, technology, and social sciences, it's vital that we learn from the past, ensuring that the pursuit of knowledge always serves the greater good, rather than justifying harm or inequality. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. This is the point where others tell you, if you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content just like this. But we know that that kind of thing is for losers. Don't be a loser. And as always, I value your feedback and ideas for future videos in the comments section below. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep embracing your inner nude, dude.